The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's horse settled slowly in the scorching Arizona heat as he approached the trading post at Devil's Canyon. The year was 1878, and the frontier was still wild enough to swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, his water running low and his horse showing signs of exhaustion. The trading post appeared like a mirage against the red rocks, its wooden walls weathered by countless sandstorms and blazing summers. Jake dismounted and tied his bay mare to the hitching post. The animal's flanks were slick with sweat and foam gathered around the bit. He patted her neck gently, whispering words of encouragement. The mare had carried him through Apache territory without complaint, though both rider and horse knew the dangers that lurked in these canyons. The trading post door creaked open as Jake pushed inside. The interior was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the brutal sun. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with supplies that frontier folk desperately needed: ammunition, flour, coffee, blankets, and tools. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man with graying whiskers and suspicious eyes. This was Ezra Hutchins, the post's owner, a man who had learned to read trouble in a customer's face. "Afternoon," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Morrison. I'm looking for supplies and maybe some information." Ezra studied the newcomer carefully. Jake was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that spoke of years working cattle. His clothing was dusty but well-maintained, and he wore his gun low on his hip like a man who knew how to use it. Most telling were his eyes, blue as winter sky and steady as bedrock. "Depends on what kind of information you're after," Ezra replied cautiously. "This here's a peaceful establishment. I don't truck with troublemakers." Jake pulled out a small leather pouch and set it on the counter. "Just looking for word about Apache raids in the area. I'm tracking a war party that hit my ranch 2 weeks back, killed my foreman and ran off with half my herd." Ezra relaxed slightly at the mention of Apache troubles. Every rancher and settler in the territory had similar stories. "You're tracking alone? That's mighty dangerous, even for a man who looks like he can handle himself. Sometimes a man has to do what needs doing." "Regardless of the danger," Jake replied. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his vest pocket. "They left this behind. Figured you might know what it means." The paper bore crude drawings and symbols that Jake couldn't decipher. Ezra examined it closely, his expression growing troubled. "This here's Apache writing, all right, but it ain't from no ordinary raiding party. These symbols, they're from Victorio's band." "That's bad news, friend. Real bad news." Jake's jaw tightened. Victorio was the most feared Apache war chief in the Southwest, a man whose very name struck terror into the hearts of settlers. His warriors were known for their cunning, their ruthlessness, and their ability to disappear into the desert like ghosts. "Where might I find them?" Jake asked. Ezra shook his head vigorously. "You don't find Victorio, mister. He finds you. And when he does, you wind up dead or wishing you were. My advice is to head back to your ranch and forget about those cattle. Consider it the cost of staying alive." Jake's expression didn't change, but Ezra caught something in his eyes, a hardness that spoke of determination beyond reason. "I appreciate the advice, but I didn't come this far to turn back now." "Your funeral," Ezra muttered. He turned to gather supplies from the shelves. "You'll need jerky, hardtack, and plenty of ammunition. And if you're smart, you'll get yourself a good pair of moccasins. Boots make too much noise in Apache country." As Ezra assembled the supplies, the trading post door opened again. A man entered, and Jake immediately sensed trouble. The newcomer was stocky and bearded, with small, cruel eyes and the swagger of someone used to getting his way through intimidation. He wore expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the rough frontier setting. "Hutchins," the man called out. "I'm here about our arrangement." Ezra's face went pale. "Mr. Garrett, I told you I needed more time to consider your proposal." Garrett laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Time's up, old man. I want that Apache girl, and I want her today. I've got buyers waiting in Santa Fe, and they're paying top dollar for exotic merchandise." Jake's blood ran cold. He had heard rumors of such men, slavers who kidnapped Native American women and sold them to wealthy collectors back east. The practice was officially illegal, but law enforcement in the territories was sparse and often corrupt. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ezra said, his voice shaking slightly. Garrett's hand moved to rest on his gun butt. "Don't play dumb with me." "I know you've got her hidden somewhere. The Apache woman my boys captured last week. She's worth $500 to the right buyer, and I aim to collect. Jake turned slowly to face Garrett. Sounds like you're in the slave trade, mister. That's a hanging offense in most places. Garrett sized up Jake with calculating eyes. This ain't your concern, cowboy. I suggest you mind your own business if you want to keep breathing. Maybe I'm making it my business, Jake replied calmly. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Ezra stepped back from the counter, clearly wanting no part of what was about to happen. Garrett's hand hovered near his weapon, while Jake stood relaxed but ready. You picked the wrong fight, stranger, Garrett snarled. Do you know who I am? I'm Thomas Garrett. I've got 20 men working for me, and we control most of the trade routes through this territory. Can't say I'm impressed, Jake said. A man who profits from other people's misery isn't worth much in my book. Garrett's face flushed red with anger. You've got a smart mouth, cowboy. Let's see how smart you are with a bullet in your gut. The slaver's hand flashed toward his gun, but Jake was faster. His Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, the barrel leveled at Garrett's chest before the other man had even cleared leather. The speed of the draw was so impressive that even Garrett paused in shock. I wouldn't, Jake said quietly. I've got no desire to kill you, but I will if you force my hand. Garrett slowly raised his hands, but his eyes burned with rage. You're making a big mistake, mister. Nobody crosses Thomas Garrett and lives to tell about it. First time for everything, Jake replied. He kept his gun trained on Garrett while addressing Ezra. Where's she? Ezra looked torn between fear and conscience. Jake, these are dangerous men. They've got connections with corrupt officials. They could make life mighty hard for folks around here. Where is she? Jake repeated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute determination. Ezra sighed heavily. There's a root cellar behind the building. But Jake, even if you free her, where's she going to go? But people think she's dead, and Garrett's men will hunt you both to the ends of the earth. Let me worry about that, Jake said. He gestured with his gun toward the door. Mister Garrett, you're going to walk out of here real slow and right away. If I see you or any of your men around here again, our next meeting won't end so peacefully. Garrett backed toward the door, his face twisted with fury. This isn't over, cowboy. I'll remember your face. And when I come back with my boys, you're going to wish you'd minded your own business. I'm sure I'll manage, Jake replied dryly. After Garrett left, Jake holstered his weapon and turned to Ezra. Show me where she is. Ezra led him behind the building to a small wooden door set into the ground. He lifted it to reveal a root cellar that had been converted into a makeshift prison. In the dim light below, Jake could see a figure huddled in the corner. Miss? He called softly. I'm here to help. The figure looked up, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Even in the poor light, he could see that she was beautiful, with dark eyes that held both fear and defiance. She was young, probably no more than 20, with long black hair and traditional Apache clothing that had been torn during her capture. Who are you? She asked in English, surprising Jake with her command of the language. Name's Jake Morrison. I'm going to get you out of there. He climbed down into the cellar and extended his hand. She hesitated for a moment, studying his face in the dim light. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she took his hand and allowed him to help her up. In the daylight, Jake could see the full extent of her situation. She had clearly been mistreated during her captivity. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and there were bruises on her arms. But her eyes held a strength that impressed him. This was not a woman who would break easily. What is your name? Jake asked. I am called Ayana, she replied. It means eternal blossom in my language. But you may call me Anna if it is easier for your tongue. Ayana is a beautiful name, Jake said. Do you have family? People who are looking for you? Her face fell slightly. My family thinks I am dead. Garrett's men attacked our camp and left my body among the others, but I was only wounded and unconscious. When I awoke, I was their prisoner. Jake felt a surge of anger at the cruelty she had endured. Well, you're free now. But Garrett wasn't lying when he said he'd come back with more men. We need to get you somewhere safe. Where? She asked. I cannot return to my people. They have already mourned me and moved on. And I cannot stay here or Garrett will simply capture me again. Jake considered this dilemma. She was right that returning to her tribe would be complicated, especially if they believed her dead. And staying in the area would only make her an easy target for Garrett's revenge. There's a mission about 50 miles north of here, Jake said finally. run by a priest named Father Miguel. He's helped other people in your situation before. He could give you sanctuary while we figure out a more permanent solution. Ayana studied his face intently. Why are you helping me? You do not know me, and you have made a powerful enemy for my sake. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering her question. Let's just say I don't like seeing innocent people suffer at the hands of men like Garrett. Every person deserves to live free and with dignity. There was something in his tone that suggested deeper reasons. But Ayana didn't press. Instead, she nodded slowly. I am grateful for your help, Jake Morrison. But I must warn you, helping me puts you in great danger. Garrett is not a man who forgives or forgets. I'll take my chances, Jake replied. Besides, I made myself his enemy the moment I drew on him. Might as well make it count for something worthwhile. Ezra approached nervously. Jake, I hate to say it, but you can't stay here. Garrett will be back with reinforcements, probably before sundown. And when he comes, he'll tear this place apart looking for the girl. Jake nodded. We'll need supplies for the journey to the mission. Food, water, and maybe a horse for the lady. I've got an old mare that's gentle enough for her to ride, Ezra said. She ain't much to look at, but she's sure-footed and reliable. As they prepared for departure, Jake found himself stealing glances at Ayana. There was something about her that went beyond her physical beauty. She carried herself with a dignity and strength that he found deeply attractive. Despite everything she had endured, she maintained a proud bearing that spoke of unbreakable spirit. Ayana, for her part, was equally intrigued by her rescuer. She had encountered few white men who treated her with respect and genuine kindness. Most saw her only as an object to be feared, conquered, or exploited. But Jake Morrison was different. He spoke to her as an equal, and his actions were motivated by genuine compassion rather than self-interest. As they loaded supplies onto the horses, Ezra pulled Jake aside. Listen, son, I know you're trying to do the right thing, but you need to understand what you're up against. Garrett's got connections all the way to the territorial governor. He's got judges in his pocket and lawmen on his payroll. Even if you get the girl to safety, he'll find ways to make your life miserable. Thanks for the warning, Jake said. But a man can't live his life in fear of what might happen if he does the right thing. You're either very brave or very foolish, Ezra observed. Probably a little of both, Jake admitted with a slight smile. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, Jake and Ayana mounted their horses and prepared to leave. The trading post now felt more like a trap than a sanctuary, and both of them were eager to put distance between themselves and Garrett's inevitable return. Which way to the mission? Ayana asked. Jake pointed toward a gap between two red mesas. Through that pass and then north along the river. If we ride hard, we can be there by tomorrow evening. They set off into the gathering dusk, unaware that they were being watched from a ridge overlooking the trading post. One of Garrett's scouts had been positioned there all afternoon, and he smiled grimly as he watched the two riders disappear into the desert. His boss would be very interested in this information. The first part of their journey passed quietly. Jake led them through terrain he knew well, avoiding the main trails where they might encounter other travelers or Garrett's men. The desert at night was a different world from the scorching heat of day. The air was cool and filled with the sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. As they rode, Jake and Ayana talked quietly. He learned that she had been educated at a mission school as a child, which explained her excellent English. She had returned to live with her people as a teenager, serving as a bridge between the Apache way of life and the encroaching white world. I have seen both sides, she explained. I understand why my people fight to protect their lands, but I also know that the old ways are ending. The future belongs to those who can adapt and find new ways to survive. Jake was impressed by her wisdom and maturity. That takes courage, he said. It's not easy to live between two worlds. Nothing worthwhile is easy, she replied. As the night wore on, they began to climb into higher country where the air was cooler and the terrain more rugged. Jake knew this route would be harder for the horses, but it would also be more difficult for anyone following them to track their movements. Around midnight, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. As they sat by a small fire hidden in a grove of juniper trees, Jake noticed that Ayana kept glancing back the way they had come. What is it? He asked. I thought I saw something, she said. A glint of metal, perhaps, on the ridge behind us. Jake immediately stood and scanned the darkness. Apache-trained eyes were legendary for their sharpness, and he trusted her instincts completely. After several minutes of careful observation, he saw it too, a brief reflection that might have been starlight on a rifle barrel or a belt buckle. "We're being followed," he said quietly. "Probably one of Garrett's scouts." Ayana's face remained calm, but he could see the tension in her posture. "What do we do?" Jake considered their options. They could try to outrun their pursuer, but the horses were already tired from the long day's journey. They could set an ambush, but that would mean potentially killing a man. And Jake preferred to avoid violence when possible. Or they could try to lose their tracker in the complex canyon system that lay ahead. "We'll take the old Apache trail through Skeleton Canyon," he decided. "It's treacherous at night, but if anyone can navigate it, it would be you." Ayana nodded. "I know that trail. My grandfather used to take me through there when I was a child. But you are right. It is dangerous in the darkness." They quickly broke camp and continued their journey, now with the knowledge that they were being hunted. The trail Ayana led them onto was barely visible, winding through narrow passages between towering rock walls. In some places, the path was so narrow that they had to dismount and lead their horses single file. The pursuit became a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out in the unforgiving terrain of the Arizona desert. Behind them, they could occasionally hear the sound of hoofbeats or the scrape of metal against stone as their tracker tried to follow. But the Apache Trail was not meant for horses unfamiliar with its tricks and traps. As dawn approached, they emerged from the canyon system into a broad valley dotted with ancient ruins. These were the remnants of an Anasazi settlement, abandoned centuries before the Apache arrived in the region. The crumbling walls and empty doorways created an eerie landscape in the pre-dawn light. "We can rest here," Ayana said. "The ruins will hide us from distant observation, and there is a spring nearby where the horses can drink." They found shelter in one of the better preserved buildings, a circular structure that might once have been a ceremonial chamber. Jake posted himself near the entrance while Ayana tended to the horses. The animals were exhausted but uninjured, testament to her skill in choosing a safe path through the treacherous canyon. "Do you think we lost him?" she asked. Jake listened carefully to the morning sounds of the desert. Birds were beginning to sing, and he could hear the rustle of small animals going about their daily business. But there was no sound of pursuit. "For now," he said, "but Garrett won't give up easily. He'll probably send more men to pick up our trail." As they rested in the ancient ruins, Jake found himself studying Ayana more closely. The ordeal of captivity and flight had not broken her spirit, but rather seemed to have revealed an inner strength that was both beautiful and inspiring. She moved with the natural grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, and her knowledge of the land had already saved their lives. "You saved us back there," he said. "I never would have found that trail on my own." She smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "My grandfather always said that the land protects those who understand it. The desert has many secrets, but it shares them with those who show proper respect." As the sun climbed higher, they prepared to continue their journey toward the mission. But both of them knew that the most dangerous part of their flight was still ahead. Garrett would not give up easily, and he had the resources to mount a sustained pursuit. The question was whether they could reach the sanctuary of the mission before their enemies caught up with them. Jake checked his weapons and supplies. One more time. His Colt was clean and loaded, and he had enough ammunition for a serious fight if it came to that, but he hoped it wouldn't. Violence would only complicate their situation and potentially put Ayana in greater danger. As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave the ruins, Ayana reached out and touched his arm. "Jake Morrison," she said seriously, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I am grateful for what you have done. You risked your life for a stranger, and that speaks well of your character." "We're not out of danger yet," Jake replied. "Save your thanks until we reach the mission." But as they rode away from the ancient ruins toward an uncertain future, both of them carried the knowledge that something significant had begun between them. In the face of danger and adversity, a bond was forming that would be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. The mission of San Rafael lay 50 miles to the north, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. Between them and safety stretched a landscape filled with hidden dangers and the ever-present threat of pursuit. Yet as they rode toward the rising sun, both Jake and Ayana felt a growing sense of hope and determination. The cowboy had sworn to save the Apache woman, but in the process, he was discovering that perhaps she was saving something in him as well. The morning sun climbed steadily as Jake and Ayana made their way across the high desert plateau. The landscape here was different from the red rock canyons they had left behind, rolling hills covered with sagebrush, and scattered with ancient volcanic formations that rose like sleeping giants from the earth. The air was thinner at this elevation, and both horses and riders had to work harder to maintain their pace. Jake had been thinking about their situation during the quiet morning hours. Garrett was not the kind of man who would accept defeat gracefully, and his reputation in the territory was built on ruthless pursuit of anyone who crossed him. Even if they reached the mission safely, the slaver would likely find ways to cause trouble for Father Miguel and his small community. "Tell me about this priest," Ayana said as if reading his thoughts. "Can he truly protect us from Garrett's influence?" Jake considered how to answer. Father Miguel Hernandez was indeed a remarkable man, but his protection came with limitations that Ayana needed to understand. Father Miguel runs a mission for people who have nowhere else to go, Jake explained. He's helped escaped slaves, orphaned children, and folks fleeing various kinds of trouble. The church gives him some protection from corrupt officials, but it's not absolute. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The desert around them was coming alive with the business of another day. Lizards scurried between rocks, hawks circled overhead searching for unwary prey, and in the distance, a small herd of wild horses grazed peacefully. Ayana watched the wild horses with particular interest. "My people believe that horses carry the spirits of warriors who have passed on," she said. "They run free because they cannot be bound by earthly concerns." "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Jake replied. "My grandfather used to say something similar about wild mustangs. Said they represented everything that was free and untamed in the world." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze. The distant crack of a rifle shot echoing off the surrounding hills. Jake immediately guided his horse behind a large boulder and motioned for Ayana to follow suit. "How far away?" she whispered. Jake listened carefully to the echoes. "Maybe 2 miles, coming from the southeast. Could be hunters, but it could be Garrett's men," Ayana finished. They waited in the shelter of the rocks for several minutes, listening intently. The shot was not repeated, which could mean anything. Hunters might have brought down their prey, or armed pursuers might be using the shot as a signal to coordinate their search. "We need to assume it's trouble," Jake decided. "The main trail to the mission runs straight through that valley where the shot came from. We'll have to find another route." Ayana studied the terrain ahead with experienced eyes. "There is an old trading route that follows the ridgeline," she said. "It is longer and more difficult, but it would keep us out of the valley." They guided their horses up a steep slope covered with loose shale and scattered boulders. The climb was treacherous, requiring constant attention to avoid loose rocks that could send horse and rider tumbling down the mountainside. But it offered the advantage of high ground, where they could see potential threats from a distance. As they crested the ridge, Jake's worst fears were confirmed. In the valley below, he could see riders moving in a search pattern. At least 6 men spread out in a line, methodically checking every possible hiding place. Even from this distance, he could make out the figure of Thomas Garrett himself, recognizable by his expensive clothing and the white horse he favored. "He brought more men than I expected," Jake murmured. Ayana studied the searchers below. "They are not Apache," she observed. "See how they move? They make noise and scatter their tracks carelessly. My people would never search in such a clumsy manner." She was right. The men below were clearly not experienced in tracking through wilderness terrain. They relied on numbers and persistence rather than skill, which gave Jake and Ayana some advantages but also meant their pursuers were less predictable. "Garrett must have hired gun hands from town," Jake said. "Probably promised them good money to bring you back alive." They continued along the ridge trail, keeping well back from the edge to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The path was even more treacherous than Ayana had warned, following a narrow ledge that sometimes disappeared entirely, forcing them to pick their way carefully across exposed rock faces. At one particularly difficult passage, Ayana's horse stumbled on loose gravel and nearly went down. Jake quickly dismounted and helped steady the animal while she regained control. The close call reminded both of them how precarious their situation was. One wrong step could end their flight more effectively than any pursuer. "Thank you," Ayana said as she caught her breath. "I was careless." "No," Jake replied. "You've been perfect. This trail would challenge even an experienced mountain man. The fact that you're managing it at all is impressive." As they continued along the ridge, Jake found himself admiring not just Ayana's wilderness skills, but her character under pressure. She never complained about the difficult conditions, never asked him to slow their pace despite the obvious exhaustion that was beginning to show in her face. She had the kind of quiet courage that he had always respected in the best cowboys and frontiersmen he had known. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the search party, but both horses and riders were showing signs of strain. The altitude and difficult terrain were taking their toll, and Jake knew they would need to find water soon. There should be a spring ahead, Ayana said, consulting her memory of the old trails. But it may be dry this time of year. They found the spring in a small grove of aspen trees, their leaves already turning golden with the approach of autumn. The water was cold and clear, bubbling up from deep underground sources. Both horses and riders drank gratefully, while keeping watch for any signs of pursuit. As they rested, Jake took the opportunity to check their supplies. The hasty departure from the trading post had limited what they could carry, and he was concerned about having enough food and ammunition for an extended flight. "How much further to the mission?" he asked. "If we could take the direct route, perhaps 6 hours," Ayana replied. "But following these ridges, maybe twice that long." Jake did some quick calculations in his head. They had enough water and food for another day, maybe 2 if they were careful. But their horses were already showing signs of fatigue, and the difficult terrain ahead would only make things worse. "We may have to make a stand somewhere," he said finally. "These horses won't make it all the way to the mission, not at this pace and over this ground." Ayana nodded gravely. "I have been thinking the same thing. But choosing the ground for such a stand is important. We would need somewhere with good cover and limited approaches." As if in answer to their concerns, the sound of voices drifted up from the valley below. Garrett's men had apparently found their trail and were following it up the mountainside. The pursuers were closer than Jake had hoped, and they seemed to be gaining ground despite their lack of tracking skills. "Time to go," Jake said quietly. They quickly refilled their water containers and prepared to continue their flight. But as they mounted their horses, Jake noticed that Ayana's mare was favoring her left front hoof. A closer examination revealed a small stone lodged in the shoe, causing a slight but persistent limp. "Can you remove it?" Ayana asked. Jake examined the problem carefully. The stone was wedged tightly, and removing it would require time and proper tools, time they didn't have with Garrett's men closing in. "I can fix it, but not here and not now," he said. "We'll have to find somewhere defensible where we can make a proper stop." They continued along the ridge trail, but now their pace was limited by the injured horses' ability to navigate the rough terrain. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers grew gradually louder, and Jake realized that a confrontation was becoming inevitable. The ridge they were following gradually widened into a broad plateau dotted with massive sandstone formations. Some of these rock pillars were large enough to hide behind, and Jake began to see possibilities for the defensive position they desperately needed. "There," Ayana pointed toward a cluster of rocks near the center of the plateau. "Those formations would give us good cover and multiple escape routes." Jake studied the position with a tactical eye. She was right. The rocks formed a natural fortress with excellent visibility in all directions. Anyone approaching would have to cross open ground, giving them clear fields of fire. And if the position became untenable, there were several ways to retreat deeper into the Badlands. They guided their horses into the shelter of the rocks and quickly set up a defensive position. Jake checked his weapons one final time. His Colt .45 was loaded and ready, and he had a Winchester rifle with enough ammunition for a sustained fight. Ayana produced a small knife from somewhere in her clothing, and Jake was surprised to see how naturally she handled it. "My grandfather taught me that a warrior must be ready to fight with any weapon," she explained. "But I pray we can resolve this without bloodshed." "So do I," Jake replied. "But Garrett doesn't seem like the type to listen to reason." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the first of Garrett's men appeared at the edge of the plateau, their horses blowing hard from the climb. The Slayer himself was among them, his face red with exertion and fury. Garrett spotted their position immediately and raised his hand to halt his men. For several minutes, the two groups faced each other across the open ground, neither side willing to make the first move. "Morrison!" Garrett finally called out. "You've led us a merry chase, but this is where it ends." "Send out the girl, and you can ride away from this. No one else has to get hurt." "Afraid I can't do that," Jake shouted back. "The lady doesn't want to go with you, and I respect her wishes." Garrett's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Lady? She's Apache, Morrison. Nothing but a savage who belongs in chains. You're risking your life for merchandise." Jake felt anger surge through him at the slaver's words. "She's a human being with the same rights as anyone else. Rights you violated when you kidnapped and imprisoned her." "Rights?" Garrett spat. "The only rights that matter out here are the ones backed up by superior firepower, And in case you haven't noticed, you're outnumbered 6-1. Jake glanced at Ayanna and saw her face set in determined lines. Whatever happened, she would not allow herself to be taken alive. The knowledge strengthened his own resolve. Numbers don't always win fights, Jake replied. Sometimes being in the right is enough. Garrett's patience was clearly wearing thin. You've got 1 minute to decide, Morrison. Send out the girl, or we'll come in and take her. And I guarantee you won't like how we do it. Jake used the minute to study their opponents more carefully. Garrett's men were spread out in a rough semicircle, but they were maintaining their distance from the rocks. That suggested they respected his reputation with a gun, which was useful information. Most of the hired gunmen looked like typical frontier drifters, hard men who would fight for money but lacked the dedication of true believers. Only Garrett himself seemed personally invested in the outcome, which meant the others might break and run if the fight went against them. When the minute was up, Garrett raised his hand again. Time's up, Morrison. Boys, I want the girl alive and unharmed. You can do what you want with the cowboy. The attack began with a flurry of rifle shots that sent bullets whining off the rocks around them. Jake responded with carefully aimed shots from his Winchester, forcing the attackers to take cover and disrupting their advance. The gun battle settled into a deadly pattern. Garrett's men would advance a few yards under covering fire, then go to ground when Jake's return fire became too accurate. They were trying to get close enough to overwhelm his position through sheer numbers. Ayanna proved to be more than just a passive observer. She had an uncanny ability to spot movement among the scattered rocks and boulders, calling out targets to Jake before they could establish firing positions. 2 men moving up the left side, she warned, behind the tall rock that looks like a finger. Jake shifted his aim and sent several shots in that direction. He was rewarded by curses and the sound of men scrambling for better cover. The fight continued for the better part of an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Jake was conserving his ammunition carefully, but he knew that time was not on their side. Sooner or later, Garrett's superior numbers would tell. Then Ayanna touched his arm and pointed toward the eastern edge of the plateau. Someone is coming, she said quietly. Jake looked where she indicated and saw a dust cloud approaching fast. His heart sank. If Garrett had more reinforcements, their situation would become hopeless. But as the riders drew closer, Jake realized these newcomers were not dressed like typical gunmen. They wore the blue uniforms of the United States Cavalry, and at their head rode a familiar figure. Captain Rodriguez! Jake breathed. Miguel Rodriguez was the commanding officer at Fort Sterling, a man known throughout the territory for his fairness and integrity. The arrival of the cavalry changed everything. Garrett's men ceased firing and began looking around nervously. Attacking a civilian was one thing, but firing on federal troops was quite another. Captain Rodriguez rode directly into the middle of the standoff. Seemingly oblivious to the danger, his men deployed in a wide circle that encompassed both parties, their rifles held ready but not yet aimed. Gentlemen, Rodriguez called out in a voice that carried across the plateau, I suggest you all lower your weapons. There's been enough gunplay for one day. Garrett emerged from cover, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Captain Rodriguez, this is a private matter. You have no authority to interfere. Actually, Mr. Garrett, I do, Rodriguez replied calmly. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of kidnapping and slave trading. You'll be coming back to Fort Sterling with me. The slaver's face went white. That's impossible. I have friends in the territorial government. Important friends. Had, Rodriguez corrected. Past tense. Your important friends have recently discovered that association with you is bad for their own careers. Amazing how quickly political loyalties can change when federal investigators start asking questions. Jake emerged from the rocks with Ayanna at his side, keeping his weapons ready but lowered. He was curious to learn how the cavalry had found them at just the right moment. Captain, he called out. Good timing. How did you know where to find us? Rodriguez smiled. We've been tracking Garrett and his men since yesterday. When we found the trading post shot up and Hutchins scared half to death, we put together what had happened. Following the trail from there wasn't difficult. Garrett made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. You can't prove anything, Rodriguez. It's my word against theirs, and everyone knows you can't trust Apache testimony in court. Perhaps, Rodriguez agreed. But I can trust the testimony of Ezra Hutchins, who saw you demand money for an Apache woman you claim to have captured. And I can trust the written statements of 3 different witnesses who saw you selling Native American women in Santa Fe. The captain gestured, and two of his men moved forward with shackles. Thomas Garrett, you're under arrest for violations of federal anti-slavery laws and territorial kidnapping statutes. Your men are free to go, but I suggest they find new employment. Garrett's hired guns needed no further encouragement. They quickly mounted their horses and rode away, leaving their former employer to face justice alone. Only one man remained, and Jake recognized him as the tracker who had followed them through the night. Pete Johnson, Rodriguez called to the remaining gunman. You've got a choice. Help me clean up this mess by testifying about Garrett's operation, or join him in a federal cell. Johnson considered his options for all of 10 seconds. I'll testify, Captain. Garrett never paid me enough to hang for him. As Garrett was led away in chains, Captain Rodriguez approached Jake and Ayanna. Miss, he said, touching his hat respectfully, I apologize for what you've endured, Mr. Syke. Garrett and men like him are a disgrace to everything this territory is supposed to represent. Ayanna inclined her head gracefully. Thank you, Captain Rodriguez. Your timing was most fortunate. Actually, the timing wasn't entirely coincidental, Rodriguez admitted. We've been building a case against Garrett for months, waiting for the right opportunity to move against him. When we heard about yesterday's events at the trading post, we knew this might be our chance. Jake was beginning to understand. You used us as bait. Not intentionally, Rodriguez said quickly. We had no idea you would become involved. But when it happened, we saw an opportunity to catch Garrett in the act of pursuing escaped property. That kind of evidence is hard to dispute in court. The explanation made sense, but Jake still felt a bit manipulated. They had faced real danger while the cavalry followed at a safe distance. But the result was justice for Ayanna and an end to Garrett's criminal operation, so perhaps the risk had been worthwhile. What happens now? Ayanna asked. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. Legally, you're free to go wherever you choose. Garrett's claim on you was never valid, and his arrest invalidates any documents he might have produced. But practically speaking, your situation is still complicated. Jake knew what the captain meant. Even with Garrett out of the picture, Ayanna's position remained precarious. She couldn't easily return to her tribe, and life as a lone Apache woman in white settlements would be difficult and dangerous. The mission, Jake said. Father Miguel would still give her sanctuary. Yes, Rodriguez agreed. That might be the best short-term solution. Father Miguel has experience helping people in similar situations, and the church provides a measure of protection from those who might exploit her. As they prepared to part ways, Rodriguez pulled Jake aside for a private conversation. Morrison, I want you to know that what you did took real courage. A lot of men would have minded their own business and let Garrett have his way. Couldn't do that, Jake replied simply. I know, Rodriguez said. That's what makes your actions noteworthy. The territory needs more men willing to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. The cavalry escort accompanied them for the remaining distance to the mission, ensuring their safe arrival. As they rode, Jake found himself thinking about the future. Ayanna would be safe at the mission. But what would happen to her after that? And what would happen to whatever was growing between them? The mission of San Rafael appeared before them as the sun was setting, its adobe walls glowing golden in the twilight. The simple buildings clustered around a small chapel, and the sound of evening prayers drifted across the courtyard. It looked exactly like what it was, a place of peace and sanctuary in a harsh and often unforgiving world. Father Miguel Hernandez came out to greet them personally, a small, energetic man in brown robes whose weathered face spoke of years spent helping others. He listened gravely as Captain Rodriguez explained the situation, his dark eyes reflecting both sadness at Ayanna's suffering and determination to provide whatever help he could. Of course she is welcome here, the priest said in accented English. We have rooms for travelers, and she may stay as long as she needs to decide what she wishes to do with her future. As Jake prepared to take his leave, Ayanna caught his hand. Where will you go? She asked. Back to my ranch, I suppose, Jake replied. I still have cattle to tend and a business to run. But even as he said it, Jake knew that returning to his old life would not be simple. The events of the past 2 days had changed something fundamental inside him. He had always considered himself a decent man, but helping Ayanna had awakened a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. Will I see you again? Ayanna asked. Jake looked into her dark eyes and saw his own uncertainty reflected there. I don't know, he said honestly, but I hope so. Father Miguel had been watching this exchange with the perceptive eyes of a man experienced in human nature. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "you are welcome to visit our mission whenever you wish. We can always use help with various projects, and I suspect you might find the work rewarding." The offer was made casually, but Jake understood the deeper invitation. The priest was giving him a way to maintain contact with Ayana while she decided her future. As Jake mounted his horse for the ride back to his ranch, he took one last look at Ayana standing in the mission courtyard. She looked small and vulnerable in the gathering darkness, but he knew that appearance was deceiving. She had the strength to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. The ride home gave Jake plenty of time to think about everything that had happened. He had set out to recover stolen cattle and ended up saving a woman's life and helping to bring a criminal to justice. More importantly, he had discovered something about himself that he hadn't known was there. The ranch looked exactly the same as he had left it, but Jake felt like a different man as he rode into the familiar yard. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the pastures, the buildings were intact, and his remaining hands were going about their evening chores as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for Jake Morrison. He had sworn to save an Apache woman from slavery, and in keeping that oath, he had found something precious and unexpected. The question now was what he would do about it. As he settled his horse for the night and walked toward his empty house, Jake made a silent promise to himself. Tomorrow he would begin making plans to return to the mission. Ayana needed time to heal and decide her future, but he intended to be part of whatever choice she made. The cowboy's oath had been fulfilled, but the story it had begun was far from over. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Morrison delivered Ayana to the safety of Mission San Rafael, but the memory of her dark eyes and quiet courage haunted him through every waking hour. He threw himself into ranch work with renewed intensity, repairing fences, branding cattle, and preparing for the approaching winter, but nothing could distract him from thoughts of the Apache woman who had changed his life. The work helped pass the time but couldn't fill the emptiness that had settled in his chest. Jake had always been content with his solitary life, finding satisfaction in the simple rhythms of ranching and the company of his animals. But now the silence of his ranch house seemed oppressive, and he found himself staring toward the northern horizon where the mission lay hidden beyond the mesas. His foreman, Tom Bradley, had noticed the change in his boss's demeanor. Tom was a weathered cowhand in his 50s who had worked for Jake for over 10 years. He knew his employer well enough to recognize the signs of a man wrestling with something bigger than lost cattle or business concerns. "Boss," Tom said one morning as they were sorting horses in the corral, "you've been quieter than a church mouse since you got back from that Apache business. Something eating at you?" Jake considered how much to tell his trusted employee. Tom was a good man, but his attitudes toward Native Americans were typical of most frontier settlers, a mixture of fear, prejudice, and resentment born of years of conflict. "Just thinking about some things," Jake replied evasively. Tom spat tobacco juice into the dust and fixed his boss with a knowing look. "Wouldn't have anything to do with that Apache gal you rescued, would it?" Jake's surprise must have shown on his face because Tom chuckled. "News travels fast in small communities, boss. Word is you took quite a shine to her during your time together." "It's not what you think," Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that. "Look, boss," Tom said seriously, "I'd known you for a long time. You're not the kind of man to lose his head over a pretty face. If this woman has got you tied up in knots, she must be something special." Jake paused in his work, considering his foreman's words. Tom was right. He had never been one for casual romantic entanglements. His relationships with women had been few and far between, hampered by the isolated nature of ranch life and his own natural reserve. "She is special," Jake admitted finally, "but the situation is complicated." "Most worthwhile things are," Tom observed. "Question is, what are you gonna do about it?" Before Jake could answer, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider was coming up the valley at a fast pace, kicking up a cloud of dust that was visible for miles. As the horseman drew closer, Jake recognized the uniform of a cavalry courier. The young soldier reined in his lathered horse and saluted respectfully. "Mr. Morrison, I have a message for you from Captain Rodriguez at Fort Sterling." Jake accepted the sealed envelope with growing concern. Official communications from the military usually meant trouble of one kind or another. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, reading it quickly while the courier waited. The contents were troubling. According to Captain Rodriguez, Thomas Garrett had been released from custody on a technicality. His lawyer had argued successfully that the federal warrant was improperly executed, and a corrupt judge in Santa Fe had ordered his immediate release. Even worse, Garrett had publicly sworn vengeance against everyone who had been involved in his arrest. "Sir," the courier prompted, "Captain Rodriguez asked me to wait for a reply." Jake folded the letter carefully, his mind racing through the implications. "Tell the captain I received his warning and appreciate the information. Tell him I'll be taking appropriate precautions." After the courier departed, Tom looked at his boss expectantly. "Bad news?" "Could be," Jake replied. He handed Tom the letter to read. "Garrett's out of jail and looking for revenge." Tom read the letter twice before looking up with concern. "Boss, this changes things. That Apache woman you helped, she's in danger again. Probably more danger than before, since Garrett's now got a personal grudge." Jake had already reached the same conclusion. Ayanna was safe enough at the mission for the moment, but Garrett would eventually track her down. The man's pride had been wounded, and men like him didn't forget or forgive such humiliations. "I need to warn her," Jake said. "And then what?" Tom asked. "You can't fight Garrett's whole organization by yourself. He's got money, connections, and enough hired guns to take on a small army." Jake knew his foreman was right, but that didn't change what he had to do. "Maybe not, but I can't just sit here and wait for him to make his move." Tom studied his employer's face and saw the determination there. "All right, boss. What do you need from me? Keep an eye on things here. If Garrett comes sniffing around the ranch, don't try to be a hero. Just tell him I'm not here and you don't know when I'll be back. Where will you be?" Jake was already walking toward the house to gather his gear. The mission first, to warn Father Miguel and Ayanna. After that, I'll figure out what comes next. Within an hour, Jake was mounted and ready to ride. His saddlebags contained enough supplies for several days, and his weapons were clean and loaded. As he prepared to leave, Tom approached with a serious expression. "Boss, I want you to know that whatever you decide to do, you've got my support. That woman must be mighty important to you, and any woman who can inspire that kind of loyalty in a good man is worth fighting for." Jake was touched by his foreman's words. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot." The ride to Mission San Rafael took Jake through familiar territory, but now he saw it with different eyes. Every ridge could hide watchers. Every canyon could conceal an ambush. Garrett's reach was long, and his methods were ruthless. The man would not hesitate to use violence against anyone who stood in his way. As Jake rode, he found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this point. 3 weeks ago, he had been a simple rancher, living a quiet life. Now he was riding toward a confrontation that could cost him everything he had worked to build. But even as he contemplated the risks, Jake knew he couldn't choose differently. Ayanna had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a sense of purpose beyond his own immediate concerns. Protecting her had become more important than protecting his property or even his own life. The mission appeared before him as the sun was setting, its adobe walls warm in the golden light. The sight of the familiar buildings brought back vivid memories of his last visit and his final conversation with Ayanna. He wondered how she had spent the intervening weeks and whether she had given any thought to their uncertain future. Father Miguel greeted him at the mission gates, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mr. Morrison, we were not expecting you. Is something wrong?" "I'm afraid so, Father. We need to talk privately." The priest led him to a small office behind the chapel, closing the door before gesturing for Jake to take a seat. "What has happened?" Jake explained the situation briefly, watching the priest's expression grow increasingly grave. When he finished, Father Miguel sat back in his chair and shook his head sadly. "This is very bad news indeed. I had hoped that Mr. Garrett's arrest would end the threat to Ayanna." "Where is she?" Jake asked. "In the women's quarters, helping with the evening meal. She has been a great help to us these past weeks, teaching the children Apache words, helping with the garden, and sharing her knowledge of desert plants and their uses." Father Miguel paused, studying Jake's face carefully. "She has asked about you many times. I think your absence has been difficult for her." Jake felt his heart skip at the priest's words. "I wanted to give her time to adjust and decide what she wanted to do with her future. I didn't want to pressure her." "Pressure her?" Father Miguel smiled gently. "My son, that young woman has been like a flower waiting for rain. She goes through the motions of daily life, helps with our work, and smiles when spoken to. but there is a sadness in her eyes that was not there when you brought her to us." Before Jake could respond, there was a soft knock at the office door. Father Miguel called for the visitor to enter, and Jake's breath caught as Ayana stepped into the room. She was more beautiful than his memories had suggested. 3 weeks of good food and safety had restored the healthy glow to her skin, and she moved with the natural grace that had first captured his attention. But Father Miguel was right about her eyes. There was a melancholy there that pierced Jake's heart. "Ayana," Father Miguel said gently, "Mr. Morrison has come with news that concerns you." She looked directly at Jake for the first time since entering the room, and he saw a flash of emotion cross her features. Hope, fear, and something deeper that made his pulse quicken. "What kind of news?" she asked quietly. Jake explained Garrett's release and the threat it represented, watching her face carefully for signs of fear or panic. But Ayana received the news with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout their ordeal. "I see," she said when he finished. "So our respite was temporary." "I'm afraid so," Jake said, "but this time we'll be better prepared. Captain Rodriguez is keeping watch for Garrett's movements, and I won't let him take you again." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face. "You speak as if my safety is your responsibility. Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Jake realized that this was the moment when he would have to be completely honest about his feelings, regardless of the consequences. "Because I care what happens to you," he said simply. "More than I've ever cared about anything in my life." Father Miguel cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should leave you two to discuss this privately." "No, Father," Ayana said, still looking at Jake. "What I have to say concerns you as well." She turned to include the priest in her gaze. "These past weeks have given me time to think about my future. I cannot return to my people. They have mourned me and moved on with their lives. But I also cannot remain here indefinitely, living on charity and hiding from the world." Jake felt his heart sink. Was she preparing to leave? To disappear into the wilderness and make her own way in a hostile world? "What are you saying?" he asked. "I am saying that I must make my own path forward," Ayana replied. "But I would prefer not to walk that path alone." The meaning of her words slowly penetrated Jake's consciousness. She was offering to build a life with him, if he was willing to accept the challenges that would come with such a choice. "Ayana," he said carefully, "you know that life with me would not be easy. There are people who would never accept our relationship. You would face prejudice and hostility for the rest of your life. Do you think I have not already faced such things?" she asked with a slight smile. "Jake Morrison, I have lived between two worlds since I was a child. I learned long ago that acceptance comes not from others, but from within oneself." Father Miguel had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. "Are you certain about this, my child? Marriage between different races is legal in this territory, but social acceptance is quite another matter." "I am certain," Ayana said firmly. "This man risked his life to save mine when he owed me nothing. He treated me with respect and dignity when others saw only a savage. If such a man would have me, then I would be honored to share his life." Jake felt as if his heart might burst from his chest. "If I would have you, Ayana, you would be the greatest blessing I could ever imagine." Before either of them could say more, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching the mission at high speed. Father Miguel moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. "Armed men," he reported grimly. "At least a dozen riders, and they do not look friendly." Jake's blood turned to ice. Garrett. He moved to the window and saw the truth of his fears. Thomas Garrett sat his white horse in the mission courtyard, surrounded by heavily armed men who looked far more competent than his previous hirelings. These were professional killers, the kind of men who would do anything for the right price. "Father Miguel," Garrett called out in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "I've come for what's mine. Send out the Apache woman, and no one else needs to get hurt." Jake checked his weapons quickly. His Colt was loaded and ready, but he had only the ammunition in his gun belt. Against a dozen men, it would not be nearly enough. "There's a back way out of the mission," Father Miguel whispered urgently. "I can guide you and Ayana through the gardens to the stable. You might be able to escape before they realize you're gone." "No," Ayana said firmly. "I will not run anymore. This man has terrorized me and threatened innocent people because of his obsession with possessing what he cannot have. It must end here." Jake admired her courage, but he also understood the tactical situation. Ayana, Father Miguel is right. We can't fight that many men in the open. Perhaps not in the open, she agreed. But this mission has many rooms and corridors. Men like these are not accustomed to fighting in close quarters against opponents who know the territory. Father Miguel looked shocked. You cannot turn this holy place into a battleground. Father, Jake said gently, Garrett isn't going to respect the sanctity of your mission. If we don't make a stand here, he'll simply take Ayana and probably burn the place down to eliminate witnesses. The priest's face fell as he realized the truth of Jake's words. What do you need me to do? Get your people to safety, Jake replied. Lock them in the chapel and barricade the doors. Then show us the best defensive positions in the building. As Father Miguel hurried away to secure the mission residence, Jake turned to Ayana. Are you absolutely sure about this? Once the shooting starts, there's no going back. She moved closer to him, and he could see the determination burning in her dark eyes. I am sure. But Jake, there is something I must tell you before we face this danger together. What is it? I love you, she said simply. I have loved you since the moment you chose to help a stranger rather than walk away from trouble. Whatever happens tonight, I wanted you to know that. Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her close for what might be the last time. I love you too, Ayana, more than I ever thought possible. Outside, Garrett's voice rose again, more demanding now. You've got 5 minutes, priest. Send her out or we're coming in. Jake and Ayana looked into each other's eyes one final time, drawing strength from their shared love and determination. Then they separated and began preparing for the fight of their lives. The mission of San Rafael was about to become a fortress, and 2 people who had found love against all odds were about to discover whether that love was strong enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them. Garrett's ultimatum was ticking away, and soon the desert night would explode with gunfire and violence. But Jake Morrison had sworn to protect the Apache woman he loved, and that oath would be tested as it had never been tested before. The interior of Mission San Rafael had been transformed into a fortress within minutes of Garrett's ultimatum. Father Miguel, despite his pacifist beliefs, proved surprisingly knowledgeable about defensive tactics as he guided Jake and Ayana through the building's layout. The mission had been constructed with thick adobe walls designed to withstand both the elements and occasional Apache raids, making it naturally suited for defense. Jake positioned himself in the main corridor that led from the courtyard to the living quarters, where he could cover the most likely approach routes. Ayana took a position in the bell tower, which commanded excellent views of the entire courtyard and surrounding area. Father Miguel had reluctantly agreed to remain in the chapel with the other mission residents, though he had provided Jake with additional ammunition from the mission's small armory. 2 minutes! Garrett's voice echoed across the courtyard, his patience clearly wearing thin. From her position in the bell tower, Ayana could see the slavers' men spreading out to surround the building. They moved with the practiced efficiency of experienced fighters, checking sight lines and identifying potential escape routes. These were not the same caliber of men Garrett had employed before. His humiliation and arrest had apparently motivated him to hire serious professionals. Jake checked his weapons one final time and tried to estimate their chances. Even with the advantage of defensive positions, they were severely outnumbered. Their only hope lay in making the cost of taking the mission so high that Garrett's mercenaries would lose their enthusiasm for the fight. The silence that followed Garrett's last ultimatum was broken by the sound of splintering wood as several men began battering down the mission's front door. Jake had barricaded it as best he could, but he knew it wouldn't hold for long against determined assault. The door finally gave way with a crash that echoed through the corridors. Jake waited in the shadows as 3 armed men cautiously entered the hallway, their eyes struggling to adjust to the dim interior lighting. He let them advance several steps before opening fire. His first shot took the lead gunman in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into his companions. The second man managed to get off a wild shot before Jake's bullet found its mark, and the third dove for cover behind an overturned table. The gunfight had begun in earnest, and the sound of gunfire seemed to unleash hell itself. More men poured through the broken doorway, while others began shooting through windows, filling the air with bullets and the acrid smell of gunpowder. From the bell tower, Ayana began her own contribution to the battle. She had found an old rifle among Father Miguel's supplies, and her grandfather's training in marksmanship proved invaluable. Her first shot shattered the lantern one of Garrett's men was using to peer through a window, plunging that section of the courtyard into darkness. Jake moved constantly through the interior corridors, never staying in one position long enough for the attackers to pin him down. The mission's complex layout worked to his advantage, allowing him to appear and disappear like a ghost while picking off targets of opportunity. But despite their tactical advantages, Jake knew they were fighting a losing battle. For every man he put down, two more seemed to take his place, and his ammunition was running dangerously low. Worse, some of Garrett's men had managed to get inside the building and were working their way through the corridors toward his position. The battle reached its climax when Garrett himself appeared in the main hallway, flanked by two of his most dangerous-looking gunmen. The slaver's face was twisted with rage and determination as he stalked through the mission, calling for Ayanna to surrender. "This ends now, Apache," Garrett shouted. "Come out and face me, or I'll burn this whole place down with everyone in it." Jake emerged from the shadows behind them, his Colt trained on Garrett's back. "Turn around slow," he commanded. Garrett spun around, his own gun coming up fast, but Jake was ready for the movement. His shot took the slaver in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. The two gunmen tried to bring their rifles to bear, but Jake dove for cover as their bullets chipped adobe from the walls around him. The firefight that followed was intense but brief. Jake's superior position and knowledge of the terrain allowed him to outmaneuver the gunman, but not before taking a bullet in his left arm that left him bleeding and weakened. As Jake bandaged his wound with strips torn from his shirt, he heard Ayanna's voice calling from the bell tower. "Jake, more riders coming from the east." His heart sank. If Garrett had even more reinforcements, their situation would become hopeless. But as the new arrivals drew closer, Jake heard something that made his spirits soar: the sound of a cavalry bugle. Captain Rodriguez had arrived with a full troop of soldiers, their uniforms clearly visible in the moonlight as they surrounded the mission. The sound of their approach caused Garrett's remaining men to cease firing and look around nervously. "This is Captain Rodriguez, United States Army." The officer's voice rang out across the courtyard. "You are surrounded by federal troops. Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Garrett's hired guns had no desire to face federal troops in addition to the defenders they were already fighting. One by one, they began throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. Garrett himself, wounded and defeated, slumped against the corridor wall as Jake kept him covered. Blood was seeping through his shirt from the shoulder wound, but his eyes still burned with frustrated rage. "This isn't over, Morrison," Garrett snarled. "I've got connections you can't even imagine. I'll be out of jail again within a month." "Maybe," Jake replied calmly, "but you won't be coming after Ayanna again." "What makes you so sure?" Jake smiled grimly. "'Cause by the time you get out of prison, she'll be my wife." And attacking a rancher's wife is a very different matter from kidnapping a lone Apache woman. Garrett's face went white as the implications of Jake's words sank in. A married woman, especially one married to a respected white settler, would have legal protections that a single Native American woman lacked. More importantly, attacking her would be seen as an assault on Jake himself, which would bring down the wrath of the entire ranching community. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the hallway, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. "Mr. Morrison, are you all right?" "I'll live," Jake replied, though his wounded arm was beginning to throb painfully. "How did you know to come here?" "We've been tracking Garrett's movements since his release," Rodriguez explained. "When we learned he was assembling a large group of armed men, we suspected he might be planning something like this." The captain gestured to his men, who began the process of arresting Garrett and his surviving gunman. "This time, Mr. Garrett, you'll be facing federal charges for attacking a religious institution and assaulting federal officers. I guarantee the judge will not be so lenient." As Garrett was led away in chains for the second time, Jake made his way to the bell tower where Ayanna was waiting. She rushed to his side when she saw his wounded arm. Her face creased with concern. "You're hurt," she said, examining the bandage he had improvised. "It's just a scratch," Jake replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Father Miguel appeared with medical supplies and began cleaning and properly bandaging Jake's wound. As he worked, the priest's hands shook slightly from the aftermath of the violence that had erupted in his peaceful mission. "I'm sorry this happened here, Father," Jake said. "I know violence goes against everything you believe in." "Do not apologize," the priest replied firmly. "You protected innocent people from evil men. Sometimes violence is necessary to preserve peace, though it grieves me to say so." As the immediate medical crisis was addressed, Captain Rodriguez approached with news of the battle's aftermath. "We captured 8 of Garrett's men alive, and the rest were either killed or fled into the desert. More importantly, we found evidence in Garrett's saddlebags that should put him away for a very long time. What kind of evidence? Jake asked. Letters from buyers back east, requesting specific types of Native American women for their collections. Financial records showing payments for previous kidnappings, and most damning of all, a written agreement with a corrupt territorial judge to overlook his activities in exchange for a percentage of the profits. Jake whistled low. That should be enough to bring down his entire operation. And then some. Rodriguez agreed. The federal authorities have been looking for evidence of corruption in the territorial court system. Garrett's records will give them everything they need to clean house. As the soldiers finished securing the mission and tending to their wounded, Jake and Ayanna found themselves alone in the courtyard. The violence was over, but both of them knew that their lives had been changed forever by the events of the night. It's really finished, Ayanna said, as if she could hardly believe it. Yes, Jake replied. Garrett won't be able to threaten you again. You're free to build whatever life you want. She looked at him intently. And what life do you want to build, Jake Morrison? Jake took her hands in his, ignoring the pain in his wounded arm. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. It won't be easy. We'll face prejudice and suspicion from people who can't understand our love, but I believe it will be worth fighting for. Ayanna's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. Yes, she said simply. I will marry you, and we will build something beautiful together. Father Miguel, who had been approaching to check on Jake's bandages, overheard their exchange and beamed with joy. In that case, I would be honored to perform the ceremony. When would you like to be married? Jake and Ayanna looked at each other, and both began to laugh. After everything they had been through, the question seemed almost absurd in its normalcy. Soon, Ayanna said. Very soon. How about next week, Jake suggested. That will give my arm time to heal and allow us to make proper arrangements. Next week sounds perfect, she agreed. Captain Rodriguez, who had finished his official duties, approached the happy couple with a congratulatory smile. If you need witnesses for the ceremony, I would be honored to stand.